You're watching 13 Wham News this morning on Rochester's CW with Doug Embledge, Norma Holland, Holly Maynard, Evan Dawson, and meteorologist Marty Snyder. 13 Wham News, your breaking news and weather authority.
Well, do you ever wonder what the heck kids are listening to these days? You ever wish the songs on the radio sounded more like the songs you listened to growing up? You're going to love hearing from our next guest. Dr. John Covach is the chair of the College Music Department at the University of Rochester. He's the author of What's That Sound? An Introduction to Rock and Its History. It's a textbook, but it really should be a coffee table book for you, I think. Dr. Covach, good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in. Okay, a second edition of this book, and you're probably constantly updating, right?
Yeah, every 3 or 4 years we will plan on bringing a new edition of the book out, mostly revising the material at the end of the book as the history develops.
But I know what people at home are saying. They're saying every 3 or 4 years, music just keeps getting worse. Can't you just leave it out? Can't we just go back to, I don't know, find a cutoff point and say that's it?
Well, the actual truth of it is that most people who teach these history of rock classes, things really only go up to about the beginning of the 1990s.
Oh,
and then
so
it stops being history at that point. It's tough to get any perspective on something unless it's been 20 or 25 years since its heyday.
That's a great point, because as much as I grumble and moan about the lack of quality in the current popular music, the context of history doesn't really allow us to pass a real judgment. But you have the benefit of somebody who's got a great context of a lot of rock and roll history. So gazing into your crystal ball, what are we going to look back in the late 90s or this decade? Are we going to regret what happened to this country? I'm not trying to overstate it, by the way. What's going to be the judgment on the music from the era?
I don't know. It's always tough to say. The funny thing is I've been teaching a class like this for about 10 or 15 years, and every year I predict to the students that rock and roll is at its very end point. We're in the sort of last days of rock and roll. And for all this time I've been wrong. I don't know why it is that rock continues to be as popular as it is. I have a suspicion that it's because the music is great.
What kind of rock? Who's playing that kind of rock today?
Well, it's funny. Every new band that comes out used to be back when I was a pup, back in the 70s. If you brought a new album out, you were competing with other bands like you that were bringing new albums out that week. But now every group that brings out a CD has got to worry about not just competing with other groups their age or through their sound, but they're still competing with the Beatles and the Beach Boys and Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin and Michael Jackson. All this music is available all the time now, and this really creates a marketplace where I don't think I would like to be an artist these days because it's very tough, the competition.
Yeah, very, very tough. I actually have some family members who've tried to break into the business. It's very, very, very difficult. Are there 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 bands that stand out to you now that we might look back on and say, yeah, they were a rock band, or they sort of continue to carry the mantle?
Well, it certainly seems like there was a very big sea change in the history of rock music with Nirvana. That period where there was a break from the old MTV thing that was happening, the highly produced videos, the big hair, heavy metal stuff. When Nirvana came and brought everything back to basics again, it really kind of redialed in the whole rock and roll sensibility. And I think you could say that in many ways we had our big punk revolution at the beginning of the 90s. The Brits had it at the end of the 70s for all kinds of socio-economic kinds of reasons, but for us there was a real recalibration of rock and roll at the beginning of the 90s, and so much that came after them, especially with the indie rockers and that whole scene, really comes out of that whole grunge Seattle revolution.
I also wonder, seeing people like Bruce Springsteen on tour, putting out new albums and whatnot, what's nice for people like myself, for my parents, who grew up on Bruce Springsteen or other bands, albums, etc., is that those artists are touring late in their lives, that they don't stop, but they're also putting out new music. So I wonder, I know there are some artists who tour because they can make money, it's a living, but there are some artists like Springsteen who are still writing new music, putting out new music. Are they, in your judgment and what you have seen in your research, are they putting out music that is still relevant and impactful and will be remembered, or is it mostly their earlier stuff that tends to stand out?
Well, it's tough to say for sure, but I think probably the music that stands out in an artist's career is the earlier stuff that really has an impact in changing the scene. I mean, Bruce Springsteen may be doing some of his best music now, according to some of his fans, but it's probably not having as much impact on other music as the music he had at the end of the 70s and in through the 80s, The one problem some of these groups have, the sort of historical groups, the Stones, groups like this, is that when people come to see a Stones concert, they really want to hear all the hits they remember. Now, if you're Keith Richards and you've been playing Honky Tonk Women since sometime at the end of the 1960s, every night, people expect that you're going to do that doggone tune. tune again. And you feel like you're in a cover band after a while because all you're really doing is covering stuff you did 35 years ago.
Well, I feel like I'm going to hit the post. We're going to run out of time, but can they contact the school to get more information? Sure.
The website for the book is www.norton.com/rockhistory.
We'll put it on our website. Thanks, sir.
Yep.